Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me. It was really great to come in and see so many old school friends here. It really makes things comfortable for me, and I appreciate seeing everyone. So I'm going to break this into two parts. I'm used to reading from my books and talking a little, so I think I'm just going to carry on doing that. The two parts are going to be, the first one will be about this book and growing up in Cordova Bay. And the second part will be going to Royal Oak School. And I'll be reading a couple of things about that. Okay? So a little bit about myself. I basically have spent my entire life on the Saanich Peninsula. From the age of 5, when I moved in with my aunt and uncle in Cordova Bay. And with the exception of going to university in Vancouver, I came back and left right after high school, came back in 1969, and worked at Seven Oaks Treatment Center. I don't know if you know of that place. It was on, Blenkinsop. I worked there as a social worker and as a childcare worker, and until it closed. But my real dream and my real passion was that I wanted to be a writer. This is what I studied mostly in university, and had been my love all of my life ever since my father gave me Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer as birthday gifts when I was 12. I love the way that you could take material and shape it into a cohesive story. And then I realized that that's what we all do with our lives, is that we tell stories, and we tell stories all the time. We tell stories about our own lives, we tell stories about things that happened to us, and that's how I came to write my Turquoise Years. I first started publishing in 1985. Basically starting from nowhere, one publication at a time in one journal or magazine at a time, until I had enough what I thought of as was credits to approach a publisher. I knew nothing about publishing. I knew nothing about how to go about it, so I went to the library, and those were the days when everything was written in longhand, and you had to go to the library and find out information. There was, of course, no access to quick information. And I went to, I got a list of all the publishers in Canada, from the big ones to the very little ones. And I sent query letters to all of them saying I had a manuscript and would they be interested in looking at it. And here's 2 sample stories. It was a collection of short fiction. And of course I heard nothing from the big publishers. And then I started to get responses from the mid-sized publishers and the smaller publishers. And some of the responses were on, sort of scraps of paper that were just sort of torn off. Sure, send us your book. And others were a little more formal. So I didn't know these publishers. I picked the publisher that had the nicest letterhead. It was mauve in color. And it was Thistledown Press in Saskatchewan, and that's where I sent my first book. They accepted it after a year, holding my breath, and it was published in 1991. That book, it was called Sick Pigeon, and it was a series of stories, mostly a lot about kids I'd worked with, fictionalized, of course, and family life and so on. It did very well. It's surprising to me. I knew nothing about awards and that sort of thing, so it got a lot of nominations for awards, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and that really propelled me and affirmed me in my my quest to want to be a writer. And then I just went from there, and one book after another. So now I'm just writing my 15th book, and it's become a way of life and my total career. But I've done it while raising a family, while trying to pay off an mortgage with my husband, with all the things that go into making a life it's just been part of it. It's been a career like anybody else would have a career. However, while all my friends have recently retired from their jobs, I have no experience of what it's like to retire from a job. And so I'm just carrying on until I no longer am interested in writing. So my family came to Crowther Bay first in 1920. And this was because my grandfather, who was a drinker and a gambler, won a plot of land off of Walima in a card game. And as a result, the family, I brought a picture of, this is my father's family I'm speaking of. I brought a picture, and you can look at it later, the Gibson family. And they all came, as I said, in 1920. And my grandfather, got this land, and the family tented on it in the summers. And I grew up hearing stories about taking the train out on Lochside, which was called the track, and the fun they had at McMorran's Beach, and all the events that were the sandcastle competitions and all the rest of it that were happening at the time. And then my grandfather lost the property several years later in another card game, and that was the end of the family's time at Crowther Bay until the early 1950s, when my aunt and uncle bought a piece of land on 4921 Crowther Bay Road, and tore down an old cabin there and built a house, and that's where I lived from when I was 5 years old until I left to go to university at 18. So I'll read some from this book, My Turquoise Years. Now this book is a memoir, and I had not intended to write a memoir. It was a commissioned book, and it came out of a conversation I had with a writer who relayed that conversation to a publisher, who got hold of me and said, that sounds like an interesting subject for a book. So luckily, it was just something that fell out of the sky on me, and I had no idea how to write a memoir. And so what I did was get all the memoirs I could find and have a look and decide, see how to do it. And I found that probably the biggest inspiration was Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes. Have you read that book? And the first chapter of that book, he's talking about his baptism. Now, he could not have remembered any of this, but it was so alive and so real on the page. It just jumped out at me. The language, the dialogue, the description, and I thought, oh, that's the way you do it. You can create around the true facts, and so this is what I did in writing this book. It covers a period of 6 weeks in 1960. When I had just turned 13, and just on the cusp of puberty, not quite there. I think we sort of got there a little later than girls do these days, or so it seemed. And my mother, who was estranged from me, my mother and father separated when I was 5. So hadn't seen her for 8 years. Was sort of said she was going to come and visit, and so this is the arc of the book. And from that sort of clothesline, I hung all kinds of things about the family, about life in Crowther Bay, and about growing up. So I'll just ramble on here. The beginning, it begins. There was just the one of me. I was my parents' only child, and when I was 5, they separated for good. It was, everyone said, a rocky marriage. Nancy was Australian, and Billy was Canadian, and they'd met in Auckland, New Zealand, when Billy was first mate on a freighter that traveled between Canada and New Zealand. According to the stories Elsie, and Elsie is my aunt who raised me, told, Nancy married Billy because he was an officer and she thought his family had money. Ha, was she ever wrong, Elsie would laugh. We were ordinary people. We even made our own clothes. Nancy and Billy were married in New Zealand in 1946 when Nancy was 30 and Billy was 39. I was born in Sydney, Australia, a year after that. Billy, at sea at the time of my birth, received the news, dramatically I thought, by Trans-Pacific Cable. There's a picture of me as a newborn being held rather gingerly by Nancy's mother, Marion Whitehouse, a woman I would never come to know. My grandmother has short hair done in waves, and she is wearing a checked wool suit. I am wrapped in a white blanket. The caption on the back of the picture reads, "To Marions." My middle name, Alice, was for Billy's mother in Canada. Neither of my grandfathers were alive at the time. Nancy, Billy, and I lived together as a family only once, in a large rented house in Vancouver for 6 months when I was 3. I played in the street there with the other kids, all of us on tricycles like some terrible infant motorcycle gang, and celebrated Halloween for the first time. This was something new for an Australian mother. I was given a small bag for trick-or-treating and sent outside without a costume to join the excited group of pirates, witches, and princesses. That whole time in Vancouver was a disaster, Elsie would claim. This was because Nancy cried much of the time. She hated the rain. She missed Australia. And because it reputedly got back to Elsie, my father and his family were so boring. Not only that, Elsie would hasten to add, Nancy was restless, wanting things she couldn't find in Canada with my father. I traveled with Nancy to Australia by boat 3 times during those early years, leaving Billy in Canada like lost luggage. We lived mostly on cruise ships, but also in Fiji and Tasmania, where Nancy had been born and where her mother and brother still lived. And then finally, when I was 5, the story goes, my father, and here Elsie would say with relish, Billy put his foot down, declared that my traveling days were over. From now on, I'd be living in Canada with him. There was no fuss the night Nancy handed me over. We were in the tiny cabin of a cruise ship that was docked in Vancouver. The boat was the HMS Orangi. Nancy was sitting at a small table and I was beside her. And there was a skinny man wearing a felt hat in the narrow doorway before us. He was smiling at me. I'd forgotten what Billy looked like. Nancy pushed me towards him. "Go on," she said. "That's your father." Soon after, I went to live on Vancouver Island with Billy's sister Elsie and her second husband, Ernie Sexton, in an area outside of Victoria known as Cordova Bay. Billy couldn't look after me because he worked on the docks up and down the west coast supervising the loading of lumber. He'd come ashore the previous year. But from that time until I was 18 years old, he visited every other weekend. He never remarried, and to my knowledge was never involved with another woman. Once was enough. Cordova Bay was a semi-rural area of farms and seaside houses 5 miles outside of Victoria. Billy's family claimed lineage to Cordova Bay dating back to the 1920s, when for a few brief but extravagant years, his parents had owned a summer place there. My grandfather was a barber, but also a drinker and a gambler, and he'd won the tiny plot of land in a card game. It was flat and treeless, about the size of a baseball diamond, not waterfront, but a short walk from the northern end of the beach. For several summers, the family and assorted relatives tented on the property. But then, in another card game, my grandfather lost the property, and summers at Cordova Bay came to a humiliating end. Then, in the early 1950s, Elsie and Ernie bought a narrow waterfront lot at the south end of Cordova Bay from Old Man Head, a frail neighbor of theirs in Victoria, and it was as if the family had been restored to its rightful place in the world. There was a sense of prestige regained, of wrongs made right. The family was finally back out the bay. The bay, as we called it, stretched beyond the shore for miles across to Darcy Island, an island that had once housed lepers. Closer in, there was Seal Rock, which you could wade to on the lowest tides when the double sandbar reached it like a shimmering bridge. There was the gentle curve of the mile-long beach with its fine sand and pebbles and scattered driftwood logs bleached by the sun. Pampas grass grew like a boundary between the beach and the places where the summer cottages began. On hot summer afternoons, agitated sandflies skimmed the sand surface. I'd watch hundreds of them feeding on rotting seaweed that was strewn half-hidden like beige rags in the sand. You could kick at patches of it and watch the flies swoop off together like a flock of startled birds. The sharp iodine smell of seaweed was marvelous. Another marvelous thing, pungent and rank. Thick beds of seaweed floated near the shore at high tide, looking like the long green hair of mermaids. And always there were seagulls cruising over the water's surface, and further out, sailboats silently drifting. Standing at the top of the bank behind our house, eager to be running free with Rip on the sandbar below, Rip was my dog, I'd often feel exhilarated by the light and the brightness and by the sense of endless space. The sea and sky on a still summer's day looked like a watercolor created with 2 or 3 strokes of the brush. I'd be standing there, my breath catching in my throat. One thing I learned in my studies of English and reading was that nobody was writing about here, where I lived. Everybody was writing somewhere else that was exotic. Even Alice Munro, of course, was writing about Saskatchewan or Ontario. But much earlier, it was everything that was interesting happened in England, or it happened in the United States. And for me, it was a revelation that I could actually write about a place that I came from, and that it was just as important and as beautiful as any other place. So I'm happy, I really was happy to do that with this book. Now, the year that I'm writing about is 1960, and I called the book My Turquoise Years for a reason. If 1960 were assigned a color, it would be turquoise, not the black and white of our television screens. 1960 was at the apex of the turquoise years. The color dominated our lives like a vast vinyl cushion. Everyone was crazy about it. Turquoise was the only color that mattered, a particular shade of blue-green that was bright, optimistic, and above all, modern. It transformed everything: houses, clothes, cars, and at Easter, even the fur of live rabbits. I'd wanted a turquoise rabbit in the worst way, but Elsie had said, "Over my dead body, you wouldn't look after it, and I'd have to, and that's all I need, a bloody rabbit." A bloody turquoise rabbit, I protested, but it was no use. I had to make do with an Easter basket that had turquoise eggs and turquoise plastic hay. Plastic was good too, anything plastic. In 1960, anything plastic and turquoise was top of the mountain. You couldn't get any higher than that. Elsie had a set of turquoise plastic dishes that she kept for special occasions. My best friend Doris and I had turquoise rubber thongs. "Is rubber plastic?" we asked each other, worried. Ernie was in his workshop banging nails when we consulted him. "Everything's plastic," he said, "even my new dentures." He took them out to show us, placing them on the shiny platform of the table saw. A full set of plastic teeth, pink gums and all, just like the real thing. "Holy," we said, Ernie standing there with a collapsed mouth. "Holy," we said again. But ultimately, it was turquoise that got our vote. You could color everything with it: metal, wood, concrete. I was proud that our house was awash in it, because this told the world that we were right up there alongside everyone else. Even if our house was little and built like a train, even if Ernie was a janitor and wore work clothes instead of a suit and tie when he went off to work each morning, we could hold our heads up. As a color, turquoise was truly democratic. It made us as good as everyone else, even as good as the Holtz next door, who stubbornly went in for brown clothes and pink house trim. "Must be because they're from England and old-fashioned," I told Doris. How else to account for such a glaring lack of style? Without question, Elsie was the queen at turquoise. Whatever she said went. The rest of us fell in line, especially Ernie, whose around-the-house work pants were splattered with turquoise paint. Elsie was the colorist and the designer of our lives, and she never hesitated. She knew exactly what she wanted, and it was turquoise everything. The floor tiles in our kitchen and bathroom were turquoise, and so were the stove and fridge, the bathtub and toilet. The trim on the house was turquoise, the throw cushions in the den were turquoise, the full porcelain skirt of the figurine Elsie kept on top of the TV in the den was turquoise. Hand soap came in white, pink, and turquoise. We had them all, but the turquoise bars went first. Elsie had made herself a turquoise shorty coat for driving in the car, and me turquoise pedal pushers, as well as shorts with a matching sleeveless top trimmed in white rickrack, my official summer outfit. Ernie and Billy had received identical home-knit turquoise cardigans from Elsie the previous Christmas. They'd worn them like twins or a brave but diminished team to watch hockey night in Canada on the first and third Saturday nights when Billy was over. Elsie sewed a giant turquoise and yellow terry cloth beach towel for me so I wouldn't keep running off with the bathroom towels, also turquoise. The whole world was in on it, even my dentist, Dr. Middleton. After my last filling, he'd acted like a magician and pulled a turquoise plastic toothbrush from behind his back and bowed. In 1960, turquoise was the color that was leading us into the happy future. We felt confident and hopeful, striding beneath our dazzling turquoise banners. If we could have changed the stripes on the old Canadian flag, the Union Jack, from red and blue to red and turquoise, we would have done that too. And one last bit about from the turquoise years. This concerns Smith's store. I don't know if you remember it. It was halfway down between the northern and southern end of the beach, and a little white store on the right by a park. Anyway, we spent a lot of time there in the summer. A dirt trail midway along the stretch of Cordova Bay Beach led to Smith's store. This trail also doubled as the public beach access. There was a small parking lot beside the store and a park with swings that fronted the road. Where the path met the beach was a rough wooden building painted green that housed chain stalls and a row of stinky toilets. The beach here was littered in summer with pale families spread out on wooden blankets having their lunches, bottles of Coke or Orange Crush, and floppy white bread sandwiches. People out for the day, chancing the tides and the weather, city people. Doris and I pitied the kids who were always hysterical at the beach, trying to cram everything into one measly afternoon, as if it was their last day on Earth. Everything they did was frantic, digging in the sand with their plastic shovels, balancing on driftwood logs, throwing wet sand at each other, gobbling ice cream cones or popsicles from Smith's store, building sandcastles, and anxiously waiting for the incoming tide so they could watch them disintegrate. And then, just when they'd relaxed enough to have some real aimless fun, they'd be shouted at and told to pack up, head for the car, and don't be slow about it. These were kids whose bodies were shamefully white or blotchy red with sunburn. Their fathers, wearing white undershirts and rolled-up pants that exposed their gnarly feet, slept after lunch with newspapers spread across their faces. Their mothers wore cotton house dresses, never shorts or bathing suits, and spent the entire beach time hollering at their kids to stay close to the shore. We pitied them all. It didn't occur to us that none of the grown-ups in our lives ever spent a full day at the beach. But then they lived there, so they didn't have to. We didn't expect it. And it would have been intrusive to have them swimming and sunbathing near us. It would have seemed strange. So I'll end that there. If you'd like to ask me any questions about this book, I did write a stage play from the book, and it was produced by the Arts Club Theatre in Vancouver in 2013, so that's 6 years ago, and had 39 performances. So that was it was a long process. It took something like 5 years and 17 drafts. And in the end, the play wasn't very much like the book. It had become a musical, which was tremendously fun for me because I'd grown up taking dancing lessons and performing for Miss Clough's dance troupes in very strange places like William Head Prison and Boilermaker Hall dances and things like that as a teenager. But it was terrifying and exhilarating to do, and to see your family, up on, a facsimile by actors, acted by actors, up on stage, including myself. At first was very, very weird, and but eventually it became something distant and quite enjoyable. So if you have any questions, or you want to wait till the end, or... Okay. So the second thing I thought I'd do today, since it is International Women's Day, and since this has a lot to do with Royal Oak School, I would like to honor one of the teachers there, the home ec teacher that I had for many years, that I didn't realize until I was well into my adulthood that she had been such a positive influence in my life. And that is Miss Horrell, who later became Mrs. White. I've written about her in this book, and I'm going to read some about that then in a moment. This is the textbook we had, Your Home and You. I don't know if you probably will remember it. I'll leave it out. You can have a look at it. It'll bring back memories for sure. It had everything you needed to know to be a successful housewife in Canada in 1960. I think it's really, a home ec teacher on International Women's Day, when we're talking about, gender equality, and we're talking about equal pay and so on. The skills I learned from Miss Horrell have really held me in good stead over all these years. I have a picture, and Enid, I've scanned it. It's of grade 7 class and pictures taken in 1960. Dr. Hartmanson was our homeroom teacher. And I know pretty well everybody here, and I know some of you will be able to add. I think you're probably in here. This is something you might be interested in looking at anyway. So Your Home and You was something that was to shape many girls' lives in this province. I don't know if this went, Canada-wide, but it was the basic textbook for home economics. So I'll read a few passages that refer to Miss Horrell. Miss Horrell, our hefty grade 10 home ec teacher, was demonstrating how to sift flour. She stood before 20 girls, massive and inviolate, in her homemade tweed suit with its homemade buttonholes, while outside the sun shone, plum trees blossomed, and sullen older boys waited for us in souped-up cars. It was the last period on a Friday afternoon. Miss Horrell held the hand-cranked sifter over a sheet of waxed paper and instructed us to turn to page 91 in our textbook, Your Home and You. Here she read aloud, "In using flour for quick breads, sift before measuring." "Write that down, girls," she said. "And remember, the secret to light muffins is sifted flour." Then she paused to deliver her revelation. "Flour must be sifted not once, but twice, if your muffins are to be light and airy." That's something you won't find in the textbooks, which meant it would be a test question on the final exam. We wrote furiously. It was 1963, and we all knew why we were there. We were housewives in training. Eventually, a perfected version of Miss Horrell's muffins would land in the mouths of our shirt and tie husbands, perhaps even in the mouths of the Larrys, Als, and Pats who were waiting outside at this very moment. Muffin making was difficult work, scientific work, we were told, and a vitally important skill to conquer if we were ever to take our places as confident homemakers of the nation. There were the exact measurements of baking powder, sugar, flour, and milk to consider, the crucial element of a well-greased muffin tin, the importance of lumpy batter. There were 6 workstations in Miss Horrell's class. Each station consisted of 4 girls seated around an arborate top table. A bank of cupboards and drawers behind us were filled with the tools in trade: mixing bowls, muffin tins, cooking sheets, frying pans, and all manner of arcane utensils. We sat with our muffin preparation plans before us and wore full white aprons with our names embroidered across the bibs. We had sewn these rites of passage aprons in grade 7 to mark the beginning of our domestic indoctrination. Ahead lay 6 years of learning increasingly difficult recipes. From pea soup in grade 7, 1 can of peas, mashed, 1 cup of water, 1 cup of milk, salt and pepper to taste, and make sure you use a double boiler so the milk doesn't scald. To macaroni and cheese, brown Betty, poached eggs in grade 8 and 9, and then on to the challenging shoulder cuts of meat in the higher grades. Marriage after high school was, of course, the intended climax of these earnest years when your home and you would become reality. Marriage would transform us, we understood, into the smiling, high-heeled blonde in the flowered apron that figured so prominently in our textbooks. Miss Horrell droned on. When is a muffin done? What are the 4 tests? Lynn, Marion, Dana, Paulette. Consulting our books, we read aloud dutifully as opposed to sarcastically. There was no sense in irritating Miss Horrell on a Friday afternoon. The colors should be golden brown, we shouted out. The muffins should pull away from the pan. When you touch the top of the muffin with your finger, the dent should spring back. A knitting needle or a toothpick inserted into the center of a muffin should come out clean. Satisfied with our answers, she instructed us to write that down as well. School was Royal Oak Junior High, grades 8 to 10, 263 kids, 13 teachers. Most of the men teachers were ex-military. The 3 women on staff, home ec, English, typing, were unmarried. The school served a wide area, the farmlands of central Saanich, the suburbs of Royal Oak and Cordova Bay, 3 miles away. The school itself was made of cement blocks and set in a gully. In winter, the gully became a swamp and the cafeteria flooded. We called the school Royal Joke. Well, you know what kids are like. Miss Horrell, like my Aunt Elsie, was a maniac for cleaning. And this was also something she taught. In those days, garbage may have been thrown out of car windows with abandon, but the ideal home was spotless. From Miss Horrell, we learned the secret of removing grime from walls, cupboards, and bathtubs, ammonia and dish soap, and how to scrub a floor on your hands and knees using vinegar and scalding hot water. We learned to use Lysol on toilets and sink, spray Raid along baseboards in all seasons except winter, put perfume on dust rags so they would always smell sweet, and cover a broom with a dish towel to sweep the ceiling of cobwebs. Not a speck of dust, not a scurrying bug, she told us, was allowed to take up residence in our future homes. We should, she said, be able to eat off our floors. It sounded like slavery to me. I couldn't get over the fact that as a future wife I was expected to do all this work. And not once in a while, but day in, day out for years. This was what having a home of one's own meant, eternal drudgery. Some of us made notes that day while Miss Horrell talked. Monday would be the actual muffin-making day, and some of us watched the institutional clock on the wall. Years later, Miss Horrell and her homemaking advice are still with me, in spite of my early resistance to it, because as it turned out, having a home of my own was really something I did want. Thankfully, Miss Horrell and high school home ec have come to my domestic rescue many times over the years, especially with her recipes for cheap and nutritious soups, boiled bones and vegetables, and the many things you can do with eggs. Her training and thrift has stood me well because, as it turned out, my husband and I were frequently broke, having to pay the mortgage, raise kids, pay for fees. And surprisingly, I find housekeeping to be a calming activity. There are times like when, like my Aunt Elsie had said, I would rather scrub a wall than have a conversation. Women didn't have yoga in her and Miss Horrell's day, but actually scrubbing a wall amounts to the same thing. Thank you for listening. So, would you like questions or?
Whereabouts did you live in Padova Bay? Was it anywhere near Mappings or not?
No, it's the other end of the beach, across from Maxine Lane.
Okay. Oh, I know that.
Yeah, yeah. Just before, no, I can't remember the next road up. I can't remember what it was now, but.
Did everybody here have Miss Horrell for a home ec teacher?
Did you? Yeah, she was. She was at Parkland too.
She went to Claremont.
I'm not Parkland. I meant Claremont. My kids went to Parkland. Yeah.
I remember when Miss Horrell lived, she built a house up on Wesley Road, just near Claremont, when the Seaview Heights was first created in 1947 when they cleared that land. Her house was one of the first ones up on the ridge overlooking Cold Bay.
Oh, wow.
She was there for many, many years.
It was the house that my uncle built was on a narrow lot, so he built it like a train. That wasn't the conception, but it was a bunch of boxes, till it reached the cliff, and it faced northeast. It was perishingly cold in winter, because in those days they didn't use double glazed windows; they were single glazed. And I remember, there used to be this great carpet hanging on the box that was the living room, the farthest room, overlooking the thing. And then we wouldn't go in there in the winter because it was so cold. It was we just huddled in the kitchen.
I remember making those aprons.
Do you?
Aprons and a towel with the name on it.
Yeah.
You remember her getting pregnant too while we were in school?
Miss Horrell?
Yeah.
Well, she was Miss Horrell, or no? When she was Mrs. White.
Right, yeah. That was at Claremont. Was that at Claremont?
Was that Claremont?
She also had a miscarriage of a pregnancy at Royal Oak when we were maybe grade 10 or
Oh.
she was teaching us from the Canadian Mother and Child.
Yeah.
And suddenly she just broke into tears and raced out of the room, and we sat there not knowing what to do.
Oh. She married later in life, didn't she? Yeah. She was my homeroom teacher, our homeroom teacher. Janet, we were probably in the same homeroom. A lot of us were. In grade 11 or 12. Yeah.
And I remember when she slipped on her polished floor and broke her arm.
I remember the broken arm, yes. I realized,
Yeah, she ran to the phone and she just.
Oh, no.
And she fell.
Another teacher I remember from Royal Oak that was one of the most, persons I learned the most from was Miss Gillen Spence, who taught typing. And hasn't that come in handy with the keyboards? And especially for me as a writer, initially with a typewriter, it was, that's one of the best skills to have learned.
I can remember her talking to me one day in the hallway and her teeth fell out. Whoops.
Yeah, and Joe Lott was the principal, and Larry Booth, Mr. Herkus, who was a science teacher? Laurie Wilson, right.
We've lost all
Have we?
Yeah, Mr. Lott died last year, and Laurie Wilson, I think, died last
Yeah.
year.
Mr. Goring was a very popular French teacher.
Mr.
Gowing, that was it. And he would tell wonderful stories about being in the war and tell us all our names, how they sounded in French. And,
Talk to Mike Henry in French, and he'd say, "I'll bet you all wish you understood what we were saying." Talking like crazy. Peter Thomas.
Pardon me?
Peter Thomas.
Yes, Mr. Thomas.
Joanne's.
My dad,
Oh, you're kidding. Oh, gosh.
long gone,
Is he? Oh.
at 95.
Oh. My Aunt Elsie lived to 98. Still full of it. Yeah.
Is your house still there?
The house was there until about a year and a half ago. Amazingly, it was the same. They didn't do a thing to it. It looked like the same. And as the years went by, it looked smaller and smaller as the houses around became these monster houses. But it was torn down finally, and somebody's built a new house there. But it still had it had blue trim, but not turquoise by the time. That's it. But still, it looked the same. There's a picture of it in the book. Yeah.
I had a turquoise plastic clock radio.
I bet I wish we had a lot. I had a lot of those items now. They're collectors' items, and we just moved on from that, didn't we? Yeah.
You said that your grandfather lived on Wallima. Whereabouts on Wallima? Did you know?
No, I don't know exactly where. It wasn't on the waterfront. It was just up.
By the school, probably.
But was it the water side?
It was the water side. Yeah, it was the water side, and they had to trek down through the cliffs.
So I was just wondering if Bill Maddock would be there, because he was a gambler.
Oh, probably. Yeah.
He was a gambler.
I think.
He lost his farm a couple of times.
Well, didn't his daughter Sarah Maddock go to?
Yeah, Anderson passed with me.
Yeah.
She's a pharmacist.
Oh.
And then the younger daughter was Sarah.
Sarah. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Sarah was a teacher, I think, in Vancouver, but she was my home ec partner.
Oh.
I even went to their farmhouse to learn how to make apple strudel. Sarah and I were trying to make this dough so thin you could read through it. Not my idea.
We didn't get anything that exotic in Miss Horrell's classes. So.
No. I remember from Ms. Horrell discussing cuts of meat. Chuck's round rump is moderately tough.
And that sentence has stayed with you.
But I think of her often as I'm making muffins. No mixing, not too much mixing.
Yeah.
No sifting, no anything.
Yeah. But I hope wherever she is, she knows how much she was appreciated.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
And don't have plates with pattern on the video and that coming up through your food.
Yeah.
I don't remember that part. But I do have all white dishes now. Do you
Well-
live in Cordova Bay now?
Do I miss it?
Live in Cordova?
No, Deep Cove. When I came back to the island in 1969 and started working at Seven Oaks, I rented little cottages there. And then when my husband and I were first together, we rented a place on Halliburton. And in 1975, moved to Deep Cove, where we rented a house and then built our own in 1980. And we've been there ever since. So I really haven't gone far from the peninsula.
You'll have to come to our reunion, Mary,
Yeah,
next year.
yeah.
Yeah, we'd love to see you there.
What was that second book called with the hair gel on?
Oh, Girls Around the House.
Is that what you thought?
Yeah.
You must have my book then.
Girls Around the House. It's I called it fiction, but it really wasn't.
It's sort of a memoir as well?
Yeah, it is. This is before people were writing memoirs, and I wasn't sure about whether I should call it,
And who was it that lived in the garden shed, the dad in the family?
Oh,
Or in a,
yes.
to get
I don't know if I should
Yes.
name names. No, she was a girlfriend of mine. But I do remember that, yeah. Whatever.
Oh, I have a question, and I know you won't name names in the turquoise years. I want to know who the girl was that would take her breasts out.
Not Tulane.
Lord knows.
He laughed. He laughed.
Maybe some of you know.
Well, obviously I changed her name.
There was no name in it.
No. Yeah, no, yes, there was.
Was there?
Yeah. But I made up a name.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't.
she was
There's only one or two made up names in that book, mainly because I didn't want to embarrass her later on in life. She might have been an incident she wished she'd never done, or that I to forget about. Like many things we've all done in our lives. Pardon me?
Lynn, with an E.
The store that you called Smith's store, was that what used to be, I lived out there before your time.
Okay.
Was that the little market?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, bottom of Halliburton. That's right. Yeah. It was there for a long time, and an old couple worked there, lived there. Yeah, they did, and they had a great supply of penny candies.
Mary, when did you have last seen Doris?
Pardon me?
Have you seen Doris in the last few years?
Oh yes. When I wrote this book, I was in touch with Doris, because she figures prominently in it. Doris Jones, and also Jenny Holt, who was next door. And so I wanted, in fact, when I was writing these books, I showed the passages that they were in to get their approval. I didn't want them, to read and not like it or be offended. And they were all agreeable. But yes, I've seen Doris, and in fact, when the book came out, Terry and I drove out to, she was living in Cowichan at the time, and took her copy of the book and visited with her, and I've been in touch. We're friends on Facebook. Yeah, she's doing well.
I would just like to congratulate you on how you captured what it was like to be a young girl growing up at that time, because it really hit home with me a great many things.
Oh, thank you.
And it was my closest girlfriend at the time, but I just, rereading that just brought back so many memories of my own too. And my mother was absolutely smitten with turquoise. We had our white turquoise counters in the kitchen. Everything was turquoise in
Our
the
sinks and everything, bathtubs were turquoise.
Yes, toilets, yes, everything. The funny thing is, as a child, you don't question it. This is just the way the world is. This is bright, optimistic, turquoise place. It's a great environment to grow up in, with that kind of mindset. Yeah.
Our living room was bright turquoise. Mom wanted it soft, like softer even than this green, but Dad went out and bought this. Oh, it's so bright. Dark, bright
And anyone
turquoise.
who drove along the
Oh,
Senate
this is
Road
gross
at
with
night,
that living room.
the curtains were all open and the lights were on, and Everybody knew the McDonald's had a turquoise.
And the,
Landmark.
and the cars too were turquoise. And my father, much to my delight, in 1964 bought a Pontiac Parisienne, which was pink, and it was as big as a boat, you know. And I got to drive it. Oh.
Is that the one in Marion House Road?
It could be. There's a Lynn run out there.
Gas must have been a lot cheaper, was a lot cheaper then.
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
Now you pay for a car, what you pay for a house.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Elsie and Ernie paid $5,000 for their lot in Cordova Bay in 1952. And, you know, and that was, you know, a stretch. We had to live with another aunt while it was being built, and, you know, it was, the whole family got in on it, and, you know, raising the walls, and I mean, he was a janitor. Ernie was a janitor at the Victoria Public Library. So I spent a lot of time as a kid in the stacks down there, you know, and looking at the old newspapers. And
Well, I think that probably covers it very well. Thank you, dear. So
oh, thank you for inviting me.